Hello and welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Stephen Hersom and I'm here today with Tom Moynahan, Lieutenant from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and we're here to talk about your thesis research. So Tom, the topic of your thesis is Terrorism and Tourism, incorporating the spillover economic impact of terrorism into the DHS risk formula. This just sounds like an interesting topic. What does it entail?
Yeah, it's certainly not the type of topic you'd expect from a guy who's been a cop for almost 30 years. Working research into the area of risk and risk management certainly stretched my academic chops, if you will. I live in Las Vegas, have worked in Las Vegas, and tourism is the economic engine that keeps our city moving and ultimately the state. Well, since its inception in 2003, the Department of Homeland Security has been providing grant funding to cities and states with the idea that hometown security is homeland security. And so that if by providing grant funding to the cities and states, if these cities and states improve their homeland security posture, then the nation as a whole has a better chance of defending against our enemy.
So with Las Vegas, what did Las Vegas do with its homeland security grant money?
There's lots of things, primarily Nevada as well as the other 50 states, including the District of Columbia. They invest in fusion centers with the idea that these multi-agency, multidisciplinary intelligence centers can have a better understanding of the threat picture, which allows the government to proactively provide greater resiliency and greater prevention. But there's a number of projects that are funded through the Homeland Security Grant Program, HSGP.
So was there more than the Fusion Center?
Oh, certainly. There's grant funding that's used for emergency management programs. There are preparedness programs. There is critical infrastructure protection programs. The entire myriad of the entire Homeland Security portfolio that rely on these Homeland Security Grant Program funds to sustain themselves.
So what type of a research question did you try to answer with your work?
Well, after the attack of 9/11, about 3,400 hotel and restaurant employees lost their jobs in New York. Aside from the fatalities, this is the indirect economic impact. Contrast the 3,400 hotel employees that lost their jobs in New York City with the nearly 15,000 that lost their jobs 2,500 miles away in Las Vegas. The restaurant industry in Chicago dropped by 50%. The number of the occupancy in hotel rooms in Oahu dropped by 50%.
Significant then.
Exactly. And so when calculating the impact of terrorism on our nation's economy, the tourist industry, which is a significant component of the nation's economy, was dramatically impacted, not just at the epicenter of the attack, but this impact was widespread and thus the spillover impact.
So the DHS grant money then made the local community more resilient, better prepared, better able to handle the results or the consequences of an act of terrorism. How does that then equate to making a more resilient or better prepared state or a better prepared national response?
Well, that's exactly the point of the research. If the money is to be allocated based on a risk-based funding formula, which is mandated by Congress, DHS was directed to create this risk formula that would drive and inform the grant allocations. And it was that risk formula that I thought perhaps could be improved upon by incorporating the spillover impact, which heretofore had not been incorporated. And so I constructed a hypothetical formula using the data from the 2012 fiscal year grant funds and applied this indirect formula index, if you will, to determine whether or not the risk matrix would have changed.
So Tom, tell me about the impact. What did you find? What did your research show?
Well, oddly enough, once we added the additional index of indirect vulnerability into the vulnerability variable, there was some separation amongst the lower tiered states. But the ranking, which is most important for DHS grant purposes, the ranking didn't change at all. It was determined to be an improvement on the risk formula when measured against 3 performance metrics: accuracy, universal applicability, and transparency. It provided greater fidelity and accuracy and granularity because in the DHS calculations, the top 17 states owned about 66% of the entire risk of the country. The remaining 34 states, now District of Columbia being one of those jurisdictions, they are all deemed to have the same risk score, which is counterintuitive, that 34 of 51 grant recipients would all share exactly the same risk. By adding this indirect vulnerability, it created some separation between those remaining 34 states. In terms of universal applicability, the Homeland Security Grant Program consists of a number of different grant funding streams, and this formula could be applied to each one of those. And then, of course, transparency, which is a big deal for government funded grant programs, because everybody wants to know how you got your data. Sure. In terms of transparency, because this data was collected from the United States Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis, this is readily available data. It improved confidence in the risk formula because of its enhanced transparency.
So because of your research, it sounds to me as if you have a more accurate picture of the true risk for your community. Is that right?
I make that argument in the thesis. But ironically enough, while the hypothesis was partially proven to be true, the real value to the research, an unanticipated finding, was that we were given the current indices that are used to quantify the variables of the formula. Given the current indices, you cannot determine what the risk is before the grant funding and then after the grant funding. So we never know whether or not we've achieved our objective of reducing risk.
So it's difficult then to allocate funds, no?
Well, that's one of Congress's questions. A number of congressional studies and a number of congressmen have come out and said, hey, are we any safer now than we were before we started handing out billions of dollars in grant funding? And the answer, as determined from my thesis, is perhaps, but we won't know unless we use the same measurement standards before allocation as we do after allocation, and then measure any difference to determine risk reduction.
So how do you see this research being implemented? Do you see a way to share your findings with state, local, and federal authorities, as well as maybe Congress?
Well, I'm hoping that this research will inspire DHS to consider their risk formula. These are questions that are already being asked by Congress, and hopefully it will cause additional conversations. Hopefully it will inspire additional research, because tourism, while certainly vulnerable to any changes related to terrorism, it's not the only one. Mass transportation,
sure,
other sectors that might have some spillover impact. So the idea is perhaps this research might inspire additional research. And then finally, we don't know, because as far as I know, there has been no research. Is there a distinction between the economic spillover impact following the Oklahoma City bombing, following the World Trade Center Pentagon attack, and most recently the Boston Marathon bombing? Is there any difference in terms of the degree of the impact, and if so, why?
So if the spending actually mitigated it or helped with the consequence management, am I following you correctly?
Or is the driving factor of the impact, is the independent variable of the impact the number of casualties, or is it another variable such as media attention or the number of terrorists involved in the attack that drives the degree and the level of the economic spillover impact?
Well, very interesting research, Tom, and thank you so much for coming in today and talking with us about it. And I just want to congratulate you again on your nomination for the award. Congratulations, Tom.
Thanks for having me, Steve.